Twilight's Last Gleaming by Alex Nance. Episode 1, Chapter 1. The USS Sovereignty moved through the black water at a depth of 400 feet, her reactor humming the low and constant note that the crew had long since stopped hearing. She was 3 weeks into a patrol that was not supposed to exist, running a course that would never appear on any official record, and the men aboard her had settled into the particular rhythm that came from spending too long in a metal tube beneath the ocean, with nothing to do but wait for something that probably wasn't going to happen. Petty Officer Second Class Danny Briggs sat at his sonar station in the control room, his headphones resting loosely around his neck, watching the green sweep of the display cycle through another rotation of absolutely nothing. The Barents Sea had been quiet for the duration. Not the kind of quiet that kept you sharp, the kind that suggested something was out there being careful. The other kind. The kind that made you stupid. He had been on watch for 5 hours. In that time, he had cataloged 16 ambient contacts, all of them biological, most of them the same pod of whales that had been tracking a parallel course for the better part of 2 days. He had checked the thermals twice, run a diagnostic on the towed array because the XO liked to see the logs updated every shift, and eaten a peanut butter sandwich that the mess had left, wrapped in plastic near the coffee station, because someone back there understood that the mid-watch was its own kind of punishment, and a man deserved something for surviving it. The sandwich had been the highlight. He pulled one ear of the headphones back into place and listened. The ocean offered its usual composition. Water moving against hull, the rhythmic pulse of the reactor coolant pumps transmitted through the frame of the boat, and beneath all of it, the vast and empty sound of deep water being deep water. He let the headphone drop back to his neck and leaned back in his chair. Across the control room, Lieutenant Commander Russo stood at the navigation table with his arms crossed, studying a chart he had already memorized, his posture carrying the resigned energy of a man who was awake because someone had to be, and not because anything required it. He caught Briggs looking at him and raised an eyebrow. "Anything?" Russo asked. "Same whales," Briggs said. Russo nodded, the kind of nod that was less acknowledgement and more a man confirming what he already knew, and turned back to the chart. Beyond him, the control room hummed along in its steady state, consoles manned, stations occupied, every seat filled by someone who was technically alert and functionally on autopilot. It was 3 a.m. by the ship's clock, which bore no relationship to whatever time it was on the surface above them, and the mid-watch had the boat in its grip. The Sovereignty was not supposed to be here. That much had been made clear before they left port, in the way that things were made clear when admirals looked you in the eye and told you that the mission parameters were classified above your pay grade and that the patrol track you were about to sail would be disavowed at every level if anything went wrong. Briggs had been in the Navy long enough to understand what that meant. It meant they were close to Russian territorial waters, or inside them, or threading a needle between the two that nobody wanted to define too precisely. It meant the 3 nuclear warheads sitting in the weapons bay were part of a test platform that Congress had funded under a different name, and the public didn't know existed. And it meant that if the boat surfaced in the wrong place at the wrong time, the resulting conversation would involve people whose last names Briggs would never learn. None of that kept him up at night. The boredom, on the other hand, was killing him. He reached for the coffee mug wedged into the makeshift holder he'd fashioned from a bent piece of wire and a strip of electrical tape, a modification that the chief of the boat had looked at once, decided wasn't worth the argument, and never mentioned again. The coffee was cold. It had been cold for an hour. He drank it anyway, because cold coffee was still coffee, and the alternative was nothing. The sonar displays swept again. Green line, empty return. He was reaching for the headphones out of habit rather than suspicion when the first contact appeared. It came in at the edge of the display, faint and moving fast, the kind of return that sat right on the line between something and nothing. Briggs straightened in his chair and pulled the headphones on fully, pressing one ear tight against the cup. He listened. The contact was there, bearing 045, closing from the northeast. He adjusted the gain and the signal sharpened slightly. A propulsion signature, compressed and quiet, running at a speed that didn't match anything commercial. "Contact bearing 045, designate Sierra 1, Briggs said, his voice shifting registers without any conscious decision on his part. "Classify submarine. Speed estimated at 12 knots, closing. The control room changed. It happened the way it always did, not with any visible shift in the room itself, but in the quality of the air inside it, the collective intake of breath that moved through every person at every station as the word contact reoriented 20 minds at once. Russo was at Briggs's shoulder in 3 strides, his eyes on the display. "Range?" Russo asked. "Estimating 8,000 yards, sir," Briggs said. He was already working the track, his fingers adjusting without looking. "Bearing rate is steady. She's coming right at us." Russo studied the display for a long moment, the green sweep painting the contact's position twice more while he watched. Then he straightened up. "Captain to the control room," Russo said. Briggs kept his hands on the console and his ears in the water. The contact held its bearing and its speed, driving toward them on a line that was too direct and too fast for coincidence. He ran the signature through every template in his head, matching it against the profiles he had spent years learning, and the classified updates that came in sealed folders before every patrol. Something about it didn't fit. Not wrong exactly. Unfamiliar. A propulsion system that sounded almost right, but carried a harmonic he couldn't place. "Getting a second contact," Briggs said. His voice was steady, but the words came faster now. "Bearing 320, designate Sierra 2. Same classification, same speed." "Same speed?" Russo asked. "Identical." The significance of that settled over the control room without anyone needing to explain it. 2 submarines, approaching from different bearings at the same speed, meant coordination. It meant someone knew where they were. Captain Lyle came through the forward hatch with the energy of a man who had been asleep 90 seconds ago and had used every one of those seconds wisely. He was already scanning the room as he crossed it, reading the posture of his crew before anyone briefed him. And when he reached the sonar station, his eyes went to the display and stayed there. Briggs gave him the picture, 2 contacts, converging from the northeast and the northwest, both running fast and quiet and holding courses that would bracket the Sovereignty if nothing changed. Lyle listened without interrupting, his jaw working slightly the way it did when he was processing something he didn't like. "How long before they're on top of us?" Lyle asked. "At current speed, Sierra 1 in 6 minutes, Sierra 2 in 8, Briggs said. Lyle looked at Russo, who looked back at him with an expression that confirmed neither of them had expected this patrol to become interesting. "Rig for ultra quiet. Come to course 180 and make your depth 600 feet, Lyle said. The orders moved through the boat and the Sovereignty responded, her systems dialing down, her hull angling into the descent, every unnecessary sound smothered as the crew shifted to the practice discipline of running silent. The reactor continued its hum because it always did, but the peripheral noise fell away in layers until the control room had the particular quality of a place where people were breathing carefully. Briggs tracked the contacts through the transition. Sierra 1 adjusted course, then Sierra 2, matching the Sovereignty's turn within 30 seconds of each other, tightening the angles, maintaining the intercept. "They're tracking us," Briggs said. The simplicity of the statement belied what it meant. This far into Russian waters, on a patrol that was invisible to everyone, except a handful of people in Washington, 2 unidentified submarines had not only found them, but were adjusting to their movements in real time. Briggs felt something cold move through his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the boat. "Third contact," Briggs said. The words came out flat, stripped of everything except the information they carried. "Bearing 175, directly astern. Sierra 3, same classification. She was sitting there waiting, sir. Engine just came online." The control room went still. 3 submarines. A box. The Sovereignty had been heading south, and the third one had been sitting on the escape route with its reactor silent, drifting in the dark, patient in the way that only something that knew exactly where to wait could be patient. Lyle stared at the display for 3 seconds that felt like 30. "Battle stations," Lyle said. The alarm cut through the boat and every man aboard the Sovereignty moved, hatches sealed, stations manned, the weapon system spinning up with the whirring precision of equipment that had been tested 1,000 times and never used in anger. Briggs kept his eyes on the sonar, tracking the 3 contacts as they tightened their formation. The geometry of it undeniable now. They were closing in, not rushing, moving with the unhurried confidence of something that had already done the math and liked the answer. Sierra 1 reached weapons range first. The torpedo came in fast and shallow, a sound Briggs had heard 100 times in training and never once for real. It screamed through the headphones and he called it out, the words tumbling over each other as his hands worked the console, but the Sovereignty was already behind the moment. The explosion struck the hull aft, a concussive blow that threw every man in the control room sideways. Lights flickered, consoles sparked, the deck pitched hard, and the sound that came through the hull was something Briggs would carry for the rest of his life. A deep structural groan that meant the boat had taken damage it wasn't going to recover from. The second torpedo came from the opposite bearing, Sierra 2's contribution, and it hit lower and further forward. The impact drove the vessel down, and the emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in the dull red glow that turned the control room into something out of a nightmare. Water was coming in somewhere, the sound of it a high-pressure hiss that cut through the alarms and the shouting and the grinding of metal on metal. The boat listed. Briggs found himself on the floor, his headphones ripped free, the sonar station above him throwing sparks. He grabbed the edge of the console and pulled himself up. The display was dead. Around him, the control room was a chaos of men trying to do their jobs while the floor refused to stay level. Damage reports coming in from every section, and Lyle standing at the center of it with his hands braced against the plotting table, giving orders in a voice that refused to acknowledge what was happening to his boat. Then the third explosion came, and it was different. It wasn't a torpedo. The sound was closer, sharper, concentrated, and it came from above. The hull breached somewhere overhead with a shrieking tear that brought cold water cascading down through the control room in a torrent that drove men to their knees. But the breach was controlled, precise, a hole cut into the top of the pressure hull with something designed for the purpose. Briggs wiped seawater from his eyes and looked up. Shapes were coming through the breach, black figures dropping through the opening on lines, moving with the coordinated speed of men who had rehearsed this exact action until it was muscle memory. They hit the deck and spread, weapons up, sweeping the compartment with the mechanical efficiency of a machine clearing a room. No hesitation, no wasted movement. Each figure knew where it was going before its boots touched the floor. One of them shouted a command. The words were Russian, clipped and authoritative, cutting through the noise of the dying boat with the force of someone who expected to be obeyed. More commands followed from other voices, all Russian, the language moving through the control room like a current as the figures secured stations and drove the crew back from their consoles at gunpoint. It was over in less than a minute. The Sovereignty's crew stood with their hands raised or their backs against the bulkheads, the fight gone out of them, not because they lacked the will, but because there was nothing left to fight with. The boat was crippled, the water was still coming in, and the men in black held every position that mattered. Briggs pressed himself against the sonar station, his hands up, water running down his face, and watched. One of the figures moved to the captain and spoke to him in accented English, brief and functional, a set of instructions delivered without the pretense of negotiation. Lyle's face was unreadable. Whatever was said, the captain didn't respond. The figure didn't seem to need him to. The attackers moved through the boat with purpose, teams splitting off toward the weapons bay with the certainty of men who knew exactly where they were going and what they would find when they got there. They were in and out of compartments Briggs couldn't see, and the sounds that filtered back told a story of hatches being forced and systems being overridden. The crew was held in place, guns on them, the Russian voices calling to each other through the corridors in short operational phrases that carried no emotion and no identity. 20 minutes. That was how long it took. Briggs counted it in his head because counting was the only thing he could do, and because the alternative was thinking about what was happening and what it meant and where this ended. 20 minutes from breach to departure, and in that time, the men in black took 3 nuclear warheads out of the weapons bay of a United States submarine and carried them up through the hull as if they were loading cargo. None of them showed a face. None of them spoke a name. Whatever they said to each other was functional and stripped of anything that could identify who they were or where they came from. Just voices in Russian, moving in the dark, doing a job. The last of them went up through the breach, and the lines went with them. The opening in the hull sat ragged and dark above the control room, the ocean pressing against whatever temporary seal the attackers had placed over it from the outside, the metal around it groaning under the strain. Water still ran down the bulkheads in steady streams, pooling on the deck, rising. Briggs lowered his hands. His sonar station was dead, the headphones hanging from the console by their cord, the display cracked and dark. Around him the crew stood in the red emergency light, ankle-deep in seawater. Some of them still braced against consoles, others just standing where the attackers had put them, their arms at their sides now, but the rest of them not yet caught up to the fact that the guns were gone. Lyle moved first. He pushed off the plotting table and crossed to the damage control station, pulling reports from the men stationed there, his voice low and controlled. Briggs watched him work and tried to read the answer in the captain's body language before the words made it across the room. What he saw wasn't encouraging. Lyle's hands were steady, but his movements had the quality of a man going through the motions of a process he already knew the outcome of. The damage reports came in, and they told a story that didn't have a good ending. The torpedo strikes had opened the engineering spaces to the sea. The reactor was still running, but the propulsion systems were offline, the shaft seals compromised, and the flooding in the aft compartments was accelerating beyond what the pumps could handle. The boat was settling by the stern, the angle increasing slowly enough to feel gradual and fast enough to feel inevitable. Then the fourth explosion hit. It came from below, a deep and percussive impact that shuddered through the entire length of the hull and drove every man in the control room to the deck. Not a torpedo this time. Something placed. Something the attackers had attached to the keel on their way out. Time to detonate after they had cleared the area because the men who had planned this operation had planned every part of it, including the part where no one was left to talk about what had happened. The hull split open somewhere beneath the reactor compartment with a sound that Briggs felt more than heard. A low, structural failure that vibrated through the frame of the boat and into his chest. The deck lurched hard to starboard, and the angle steepened sharply. The front rising as the stern dropped, seawater pouring into the aft sections with a roar that swallowed every other sound in the boat. The emergency lighting flickered, steadied, then began to fail in sections. The red glow retreating toward the forward compartments as the power systems gave out one by one. Briggs grabbed the edge of his console and held on. The water was at his knees now and rising fast, the cold of it so sudden and so complete that his legs went numb almost immediately. Around him the crew was moving, some of them trying to reach the forward hatches, others working damage control stations that were no longer responding, all of them doing the things that training had put into their hands because training was the only thing left. The boat was dying, and everyone aboard her knew it, and what each man did with that knowledge was his own. Lyle was still at the center of the control room. He had stopped giving orders, not because he had given up, but because there were no orders left to give. The flooding was catastrophic and accelerating. The depth gauge, one of the few instruments still functioning, showed the boat sinking, the numbers climbing with a steady patience that made Briggs look away. The water reached his waist. He thought about the men who had come through the hull, the precision of them, the patience. 3 submarines positioned in advance, the attack choreographed down to the minute, the warheads extracted in 20 minutes, and the boat left to die on a timetable that had been decided before the first torpedo was ever fired. They had known where the Sovereignty was. They had known what she was carrying. They had known exactly how to take it, and exactly how to make sure the only evidence that remained was a hull on the bottom of the Barents Sea, resting in Russian territorial waters with American markings and no surviving crew to explain what had actually happened inside it. The water reached his chest. The cold had stopped registering. The control room was almost entirely dark now, the last of the emergency lights casting a weak red glow that barely reached the nearest bulkhead. Somewhere forward a hatch failed, and the sound of the ocean coming through it was the loudest thing Briggs had ever heard. A wall of noise that filled the boat from bow to stern and ended every other sound inside it. He let go of the console. There was nothing left to hold onto and nowhere left to go. The Sovereignty was going down, and everyone aboard her was going with it, and the men who had done this were already gone, moving through the dark water above with 3 nuclear warheads, and the quiet confidence of people who had just gotten away with something the world would never know the truth about. The water closed over him, and the boat fell into the deep, the sea keeping its silence the way it always did. Chapter 2. The warehouse sat at the end of a gravel road on the outskirts of Tbilisi, flanked by two smaller buildings that had been light industrial once and were nothing now. The whole compound had the look of a place that had changed hands enough times that nobody remembered who owned it, which made it a perfect place to store things that weren't supposed to exist. Sam Colvin's voice came through the earpiece, calm and unhurried, carrying the particular authority of a man who had never once raised his voice on an operation because he had never needed to. "Voss, where are we?" Connor Voss was 60 yards from the compound's front gate, sitting in the passenger seat of a rented sedan with the window cracked and a pair of compact binoculars resting on his knee. The gate was manned by two guards who had been rotating on a predictable schedule for the 3 days he had been watching them. He had their patterns down to the minute. He had their names. He had the brand of cigarettes the older one smoked and the name of the woman the younger one had been texting for the past 2 hours. "Two on the gate, same rotation. Shift change in 4 minutes, Voss said. "The new pair always takes about 90 seconds to get settled. That's our window." "Copy. Delgado, you set?" Vic Delgado was prone on the roof of the easternmost building, positioned behind a ventilation unit that gave him a clean line of sight across the compound's interior courtyard. The M240 was set up on its bipod in front of him, the belt loaded and the feed tray closed, the weapon ready to do what it was built for. Beside it, because Delgado never went anywhere with just one option, a second belt sat coiled in a pouch within arm's reach. "Born ready, boss," Delgado said. "I've got eyes on the courtyard, 4 tangos visible, 2 near the main door, 2 on the far side by the loading dock. They look bored." "They won't be for long. Knox?" Eli Knox didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was barely above a murmur, the mic picking up just enough to transmit. "I'm here." That was it. 2 words, delivered with the conversational enthusiasm of a man ordering coffee he didn't particularly want. Knox was somewhere above and behind the compound, nested into a position he had chosen 3 hours before dawn and hadn't moved from since. Nobody on the team knew exactly where he set up on any given operation. They just knew that when the shooting started, the first round from his rifle would arrive before the sound did, and that was enough. "Milligan, talk to me," Colvin said. Cass Milligan was crouched at the base of the compound's rear wall, pressed flat against the concrete, his back to the rough surface and a breaching charge in his hand. He had a rifle slung across his chest and a knife on his belt, and the kind of energy radiating off him that suggested he would happily use either one or neither one, and just handle things with his hands if the opportunity presented itself. "Rear wall is clear, charge is set. Just say the word and I'll blow this thing wide open," Milligan said. "Patience." "That's easy for you to say. You're not the one squatting in the dark next to a building that smells like diesel and goat shit." A low chuckle moved through the comms, Delgado's laugh unmistakable even compressed through the radio. Colvin let it pass without comment, which was its own kind of permission. "Voss, start moving," Colvin said. Voss set the binoculars down and checked himself in the rearview mirror. The suit was Georgian-made, the kind of thing a mid-level business contact would wear to a meeting he wanted to seem important at. The briefcase on the back seat held nothing of value, but it looked like it did, which was all that mattered. He straightened his tie, stepped out of the sedan, and walked toward the gate with the easy confidence of a man who had been expected. The 2 guards saw him coming and straightened up, hands moving toward weapons out of reflex. Voss raised one hand in a casual wave and called out to them in Georgian, his accent clean enough to pass for local, and warm enough to sound like he'd been here before. The older guard's hand came off his weapon. The younger one kept his where it was, but his posture softened. Voss reached the gate and stopped, keeping a comfortable distance. He spoke easily, gesturing back toward the sedan, then toward the compound, painting a picture with his hands and his tone that required no actual truth behind it. He mentioned a name, someone connected to whoever ran this operation, someone the guards would have heard of. The older guard nodded. The younger one looked at his partner for confirmation. Voss smiled and kept talking. On the comms, Colvin listened to the exchange without interrupting. Voss was doing what Voss did, and what Voss did was something that couldn't be taught at any school the military ran. The man could walk into a room full of strangers in a country he'd never been to, and leave an hour later with half of them thinking he was a friend and the other half thinking he was someone they should want to be friends with. It was a gift and it was a weapon. and right now it was buying the team exactly what they needed. Time. Shift change happening now, Voss said, the words folded into a pause in his conversation with the guards, delivered low enough that only the earpiece caught them. You've got your 90 seconds. Copy. Everyone move, Colvin said. At the rear wall, Milligan triggered the breaching charge. The explosion was sharp and contained, punching a hole through the concrete large enough for a man to step through without ducking. He was moving before the dust had finished falling, through the gap and into the back corridor of the warehouse, his rifle up and his feet carrying him forward with the momentum of someone who treated caution as a suggestion. On the roof, Delgado shifted the M240's barrel 2 degrees to the right as the courtyard below him reacted to the explosion. The two men near the main door spun toward the sound. The two at the loading dock froze for a half second, then started running. I've got the runners, Delgado said. The M240 opened up with a sound that filled the compound and the surrounding quarter mile with the unmistakable authority of belt-fed automatic fire. The two men heading for the loading dock went down before they had covered 10 yards, the rounds finding them in sequence, the weapon's cyclic rate doing the work of something that had been pointed by a man who understood exactly how much trigger pressure put rounds exactly where they needed to go. Delgado released the trigger, shifted left, and waited. Runners are down, Delgado said, his voice carrying the same easy cadence it had 5 minutes ago. 2 at the main door are heading inside. Knox, Colvin said. The rifle report came from somewhere distant, a single flat crack that arrived at the compound a moment after the bullet did. One of the 2 men at the main door pitched forward and hit the ground. The second man looked at his partner, looked up toward the hills, and made the decision to get inside the building as fast as his legs could carry him. He almost made it. The second shot was closer to the first than the first had been, to the command that called for it. The man dropped against the doorframe and slid down it, his hand still reaching for the handle. Clear, Knox said. Inside the warehouse, Milligan was moving fast. The back corridor opened into a larger storage space, crates stacked floor to ceiling, the air thick with dust kicked up by the breach. 2 men came around a stack of crates and met him head-on. Milligan shot the first one from 8 feet away, a single round that put the man on his back. The second one got close enough to grab the barrel of the rifle, which turned out to be a mistake of the highest order. Milligan let go of the rifle entirely. His right hand came up and caught the man by the throat, driving him backward into the crate stack with enough force to buckle the wooden frame. The man hit the crates, and the crates hit the wall, and Milligan hit the man twice more before he had finished processing the first impact. The body went limp, and Milligan let it drop, retrieved his rifle from the floor, and kept moving. Rear section is clear, Milligan said. He wasn't breathing hard. He sounded like he was walking through a park. At the front gate, Voss had kept the conversation going through the explosion, the gunfire, and the unmistakable sound of a belt-fed weapon tearing through the courtyard. The 2 guards had turned at the first noise and were reaching for their weapons when Voss moved. He closed the distance before either man had his gun level, driving the heel of his palm into the older guard's jaw and sending him into the gate. The younger one got his weapon up, but Voss was already inside his reach, one hand redirecting the barrel toward the ground, while the other drove a short, efficient strike into the man's solar plexus that folded him in half. Both guards were on the ground in under 3 seconds, disarmed and out of the fight. Voss straightened his tie and stepped over them. Gate is secure. I'm coming in, Voss said. Colvin was already through the main door, moving past Knox's 2 kills with his rifle up and his eyes sweeping the entry hall. The warehouse interior was a maze of crates and shelving, the overhead lights casting uneven pools of brightness that left hard shadows between the stacks. He moved through it with the practiced economy of a man who had cleared more rooms than he could count, checking corners, reading the space. Delgado, come down and hold the courtyard, Colvin said. Voss, find the office. Whatever paperwork these people have, I want it. Already looking, Voss said. Colvin pushed deeper into the building. The crates around him bore no markings, stenciled labels that had been painted over, or shipping manifests that had been stripped. Whatever was in them had been deliberately anonymized. He pulled the lid off one as he passed. Assault rifles, packed in grease, stacked 6 deep. He moved on. A door at the end of the aisle stood closed. Colvin approached it with his rifle level, pausing at the frame. Through the thin wall he could hear movement, the shuffling of someone trying to decide between fighting and hiding. He tested the handle. Locked. He stepped back, and Milligan materialized beside him, as if he had been waiting for exactly this moment, which, knowing Milligan, he probably had. "Allow me," Milligan said. He kicked the door clean off its hinges. It flew inward and struck whoever was standing behind it, sending the man sprawling backward across a desk cluttered with papers and electronics. Milligan was through the opening before the door had finished landing, scooping the dazed man off the desk by the front of his shirt and depositing him on the floor with a firmness that left no ambiguity about the new arrangement. Colvin stepped in behind him and looked down at the man on the floor, then around the room. A small office, monitors on the wall, showing security feeds that were now displaying empty courtyards and unmanned gates. A laptop, open and running, a satellite phone on the desk. "Secure him," Colvin said. Milligan produced a zip tie from his vest with the speed of a magic trick and had the man's wrists bound before he had fully registered what was happening. The man started talking, fast and frightened, the words tumbling out in Georgian. Colvin held up a hand, and the man went quiet. He keyed his radio. "Building is secure. Voss, I need you in the office," Colvin said. "On my way," Voss said. Colvin turned to the monitors. The courtyard feeds showed Delgado crossing the open space with the M240 resting across his shoulders, moving toward the main door with the unhurried walk of a man who had done his part and was in no rush to find more. Knox's position was invisible on any of the cameras, which was how Knox liked it. Milligan leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, looking at the bound man on the floor with an expression of cheerful menace. "You know, I didn't even get to use the knife," Milligan said. He sounded genuinely disappointed. Colvin glanced at him. "Night's young," Colvin said. Voss came through the doorway and took in the room with a single sweep. His eyes went to the laptop first, then the satellite phone, then the bound man on the floor who had started shaking. Voss crouched beside him and spoke in Georgian, his tone shifting to something conversational and almost kind, the way a doctor might talk to a patient before delivering bad news. The man looked up at him, and whatever Voss said next made the fear in his face compete with something like hope. Voss listened to the response, asked a follow-up, listened again. Then he stood and looked at Colvin. "Shipment goes out tomorrow morning. Buyer is arriving tonight to inspect," Voss said. "Where?" "He doesn't know, just knows someone is coming." Colvin looked at the crates visible through the office door, row after row of them stretching into the warehouse. Then he looked at the monitors, the empty compound. His team settled into position around the building, like they owned it. The corner of his mouth turned up. "Then I guess we'd better make them feel welcome," Colvin said. He reached for his radio. "All right, listen up. We're staying put. Delgado, find the perimeter and lock it down. Knox, hold your position. Milligan, grab Whitlock and start cataloging these crates. I want to know everything that's in this building before our guest arrives." The responses came back in sequence, each one carrying its own texture. Delgado's easy confidence, Knox's economy, Milligan's restless energy. Colvin stood in the middle of the office, surrounded by the evidence of an operation his team had just taken apart in under 4 minutes, and began planning the next one. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to show over the hills east of the city. And somewhere on those hills, a sniper who hadn't moved in 6 hours adjusted his scope and waited for whatever came next. Chapter 3. Sean Whitlock had been listening to other people's conversations for 11 hours. He was set up in a van parked 200 meters east of the compound, wedged between the driver's seat and a bank of communications equipment that took up most of the interior. 3 monitors glowed in front of him, each one running a different feed. The left displayed a waveform analyzer tied into a broadband receiver that was pulling signals out of the local cellular traffic. The center showed a real-time transcript he was building manually, typing with one hand while the other adjusted frequencies on the receiver. The right monitor held a map of the area with overlay markers for every known position, friendly and otherwise. The van smelled like cold coffee and the particular kind of staleness that came from a human being sitting in an enclosed space for too long, without opening a window. Whitlock had stopped noticing it around hour 6. His headphones carried a constant stream of noise. Most of it was garbage, local cell traffic, personal calls, A woman 3 blocks away having an argument with her landlord that had been going on intermittently since midnight, but threaded through the garbage, if you knew what to listen for, were the conversations that mattered. Short exchanges on prepaid phones, coded language that wasn't as coded as the speakers thought it was. Russian, Georgian, and occasionally a third language that Whitlock had identified 4 hours ago as Chechen, spoken by someone who was careful enough to keep the calls under 30 seconds and sloppy enough to use the same phone twice. Whitlock caught the edge of a new transmission and adjusted the frequency, locking it in. 2 voices, both male, both speaking Russian. He leaned forward and listened, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The first voice was giving directions. Not street names, but landmarks. A pharmacy with a green awning, a church with scaffolding on the bell tower, a left turn after the 3rd intersection. The second voice repeated them back, the cadence of someone writing it down. Whitlock typed as fast as they spoke, his Russian fluent enough that the translation happened in the same motion as the transcription. The English words appearing on the center monitor almost in real time. The call ended. Whitlock sat back and read what he had, cross-referencing the landmarks against the map on the right monitor. It took him 40 seconds to plot the route. It led directly to the compound. He keyed his radio. "Colvin, it's Whitlock. I've got a call on the intercept. 2 voices, Russian speakers, one of them giving directions to the compound. Sounds like your buyer is on his way," Whitlock said. Colvin's response came back measured and unhurried. "How long?" Colvin asked. "Based on the route, 30 minutes, maybe less if he's already moving," Whitlock said. "How many?" Colvin asked. The call only had 2 voices, but the directions referenced a parking area large enough for multiple vehicles. "I'd planned for more than 2, Whitlock said. A brief pause on the line, the kind that meant Colvin was adjusting the picture in his head and redistributing the pieces. "Copy. Keep monitoring and let me know if anything changes," Colvin said. Whitlock went back to the headphones. The local traffic continued its steady churn, and he moved through it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years learning to separate signal from noise, not just in the technical sense, but in the human one. Language was pattern, and pattern was information, and information was the thing that kept people alive when the shooting started. Every accent carried geography. Every word choice carried education, class, intent. A man who said one thing and meant another left fingerprints in his syntax that were as readable as a forged document if you knew what to look for. Whitlock knew what to look for. He caught another transmission 8 minutes later. Same phone as the Chechen speaker from earlier, the one who kept his calls short. But this time, the man wasn't speaking Chechen. He was speaking Russian, and he was speaking it to someone new, and what he was saying made Whitlock straighten up in his chair. The man was issuing instructions, not receiving them, giving them, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The instructions were specific. A second team, already in position, waiting 3 blocks north of the compound. Their job was to watch, let the buyer go in, and then move on the building after the transaction was confirmed. Take everything. Leave no one. Whitlock's hands stopped moving on the keyboard. He listened to the rest of the call, letting the words pass through him without reaching for the keys, absorbing the full picture before committing any of it to text. The call lasted 19 seconds. When it ended, he sat in the quiet of the van for a moment, running it back in his head, making sure he hadn't misread the idiom or mistaken the intent. He hadn't. He keyed the radio. "Colvin, we have a problem," Whitlock said. "Go ahead," Colvin said. "I just intercepted a call from a third party, Chechen speaker, same one I've been tracking all night. He's got a team staged 3 blocks north. They're planning to hit the compound after the buyer arrives. It's a rip job. They want the weapons and the buyer's money," Whitlock said. The silence on the other end lasted 2 full seconds, which was a long time for Colvin. "How many?" Colvin asked. He didn't say, but the way he was talking, it's not a small crew. He was giving orders to at least 2 subordinates, and the language suggested he was coordinating something with enough moving parts to need a staging area, Whitlock said. "Did he mention a timeline?" Colvin asked. "After the buyer enters the compound. They're going to let the deal start, then move," Whitlock said. Another pause. When Colvin came back, his voice had shifted by a degree. Not concern exactly, but the recalibration of a man who had just been told the chessboard had more pieces on it than he'd counted. "All right, new plan. Whitlock, I need you to keep that Chechen's phone hot. If he makes another call, I want to know about it before he hangs up," Colvin said. "Already on it," Whitlock said. "Knox, did you catch that?" Colvin asked. Knox's voice came through, unhurried as ever. "I caught it," Knox said. "Can you see 3 blocks north from where you are?" Colvin asked. A pause. Whitlock imagined Knox adjusting his scope, scanning rooftops and side streets from whatever impossible vantage he had found in the hills. "I can see the staging area, 2 vehicles, 4, no, 5 men, armed. They're sitting tight," Knox said. "Keep eyes on them." "Whitlock, what's our buyer's ETA?" Colvin asked. Whitlock checked the timestamp on the intercepted directions and did the math against the route. 15 minutes, give or take," Whitlock said. "Then we have 15 minutes to set up a welcome for 2 groups instead of 1. Voss, Delgado, Milligan, rally in the office. Knox, you stay put and watch the north team. Whitlock, you're my ears. Anything moves, anything changes, I hear about it," Colvin said. The responses came back, and Whitlock returned to the headphones. The next 14 minutes were a masterclass in the particular kind of work that never made it into after-action reports. Whitlock tracked 3 more calls, 2 from the Chechen coordinating his team's movement, 1 from the buyer's driver confirming he was close. Each one gave him another piece, and each piece went to Colvin within seconds of Whitlock hearing it. The Chechen's team had grown to 7. They were splitting into 2 elements, 1 for the front approach and 1 to cut off the rear. The buyer was traveling with 3 men, all armed, in a single SUV. Whitlock relayed it all, his voice steady, the translations clean. He didn't editorialize. He didn't speculate. He gave Colvin the words and let the man who made the decisions make the decisions. "Buyer's vehicle just turned onto the access road," Whitlock said. "Copy. Everyone hold," Colvin said. Through the van's windshield, Whitlock could see the distant shape of an SUV moving down the gravel road toward the compound gate. It pulled up and stopped, headlights cutting through the pre-dawn gray. A man stepped out of the passenger side and approached the gate, which Voss had left looking undisturbed from the outside. "He's at the gate, 1 man approaching on foot, 3 still in the vehicle," Whitlock said. "Let him in. Voss, you're on," Colvin said. What happened next? Whitlock could only piece together from the radio traffic and the distant sounds that carried across the 200 meters between the van and the compound. Voss met the buyer's man at the gate with the same easy authority he had used on the guards, playing the role of someone who belonged there. The man went back to the SUV. All 4 got out. Voss walked them in. Then the Chechen's phone lit up again. The call was 3 seconds long. A single word, repeated once. Whitlock didn't need a translation. He keyed the radio so fast his thumb hit the button before the call had fully ended. "They're moving. North team is moving now," Whitlock said. "Knox," Colvin said. "I see them," Knox said. 2 on foot coming down the main road, 3 more flanking through the alley on the east side. "Can you slow them down?" Colvin asked. "I can do more than slow them down," Knox said. The first shot reached Whitlock's ears a moment later, distant and clean, the sound rolling across the low buildings between the van and Knox's position. A second shot followed, spaced with the deliberate rhythm of a man who took exactly as much time as he needed between triggers and not a fraction more. 2 down on the main road. East Group is pulling back into cover, Knox said. "Whitlock, is the Chechen talking?" Colvin asked. Whitlock already had the frequency isolated. The phone was active, the Chechen's voice sharp with surprise, barking orders that had shifted from offensive to reactive in the span of 2 rifle shots. Whitlock listened and translated on the fly. "He's pulling them back, telling them to regroup at the vehicles. He didn't expect resistance. He thought the compound was undefended," Whitlock said. "Knox, can you reach the vehicles?" Colvin asked. A pause that lasted exactly long enough for Knox to do the math on distance and angle. "The lead vehicle, yes. The second one is behind a building," Knox said. "Disable the lead vehicle. I want them on foot with nowhere to go," Colvin said. The shot that followed was different from the ones before, a single report that carried a heavier resonance, aimed at metal and engine block rather than flesh. Whitlock heard it and then heard the Chechen's voice spike on the intercept, the man's careful operational discipline cracking as his exit strategy disintegrated in real time. Whitlock translated it as it came. He's panicking, telling his men to scatter. Whitlock paused, listening. He's on foot now, moving south, alone. South puts him on the access road, Colvin said. Delgado? I'm on the roof. I can see the road, Delgado said. No visual yet, but if he comes down this way, he's mine. Whitlock listened as the Chechen's phone went silent. He scanned the other frequencies, checked the buyers' phones, swept the local traffic. Everything that had been moving was going still. The Chechen's team had scattered. The buyer and his men were inside the compound with Voss and Colvin. The operation was collapsing into its final shape. Colvin, the buyer's people are calling out. One of them is trying to reach someone, but nobody's picking up. I think they know something went wrong outside, Whitlock said. It went wrong for everyone except us. Buyer is secured. Voss is handling it, Colvin said. Milligan, sweep the perimeter. If anyone from the North team made it this far, I want them found. With pleasure, Milligan said. The next 20 minutes played out in fragments across Whitlock's headphones and radio. Milligan found one of the Chechen's men hiding behind a dumpster 50 meters from the compound wall. The encounter was brief and loud, and ended with Milligan requesting a zip tie and sounding deeply satisfied. Delgado reported the access road clear. Knox confirmed the remaining members of the North team had dispersed into the surrounding streets and were no longer a factor. The operation was over. Whitlock pulled his headphones off and set them on the console. He leaned back in the chair, such as it was, and stared at the ceiling of the van for a long moment. The quiet was sudden and total, the absence of the constant feed leaving a ringing in his ears that took a minute to fade. He rubbed his eyes, checked the time, and started the process of shutting down the equipment and packing the van. By the time he walked through the compound gate on foot and crossed the courtyard to the warehouse, the sky had lightened enough to wash the buildings in a pale gray that made everything look tired. Delgado was sitting on a crate near the main door, the M240 resting across his knees, a protein bar in one hand and a grin on his face. There he is, Delgado said, the man behind the curtain. Someone's got to do the boring work, Whitlock said. Boring? Brother, you caught that second team cold. If you hadn't picked up that call, we'd be having a very different morning, Delgado said. Whitlock gave him a nod and kept walking. Inside the warehouse, the aftermath of the operation was spread out in the particular way that these things always were. Organized chaos, the detained buyer and his men seated against a wall with their hands bound, Milligan standing nearby with his arms crossed and the air of a man daring someone to give him a reason. The Chechen's man from the dumpster sat separately, looking considerably worse for the encounter. Voss was at the office desk, working through the laptop and the satellite phone, pulling data with the efficiency of someone who had done this particular kind of digital excavation dozens of times. He glanced up as Whitlock came through the door. Nice catch out there, Voss said. He turned back to the laptop, and then, almost as an afterthought, added, for a guy who just sits and listens. The words landed with a weight that was carefully calibrated, not quite dismissive, not quite a compliment. Somewhere in between, the kind of thing that could be read as a joke or an insult depending on how generous you were feeling. Whitlock looked at him for a moment. Sitting and listening is the reason you're not picking a Chechen's bullets out of your back right now, Whitlock said. Voss's hand paused on the keyboard for just a beat. Then the corner of his mouth moved, a fraction of an inch, the closest thing to acknowledgement he was going to offer. He went back to typing. Whitlock moved past him and found Colvin in the back of the warehouse, standing among the rows of opened crates, a small notebook in his hand. The team leader was making a count, his pen moving in short, precise marks, cataloging what they had found with the methodical attention of someone who understood that the intelligence value of an arms cache was in the details, not the spectacle. He looked up when Whitlock approached, and something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically. Colvin didn't do dramatic. But the look he gave Whitlock carried a warmth that was absent from the way he looked at equipment or crates or problems to be solved. It was brief and it was quiet, the kind of acknowledgement that didn't need words to land. Good work tonight, Colvin said. 3 words and a look. That was all. Colvin went back to his notebook, and Whitlock stood there for a moment, letting it settle. In the grand economy of the team, where Milligan kicked down doors and Delgado held positions and Knox put rounds through targets from distances that didn't seem possible, the work of sitting in a van and listening to strangers talk was never going to carry the same weight. Whitlock knew that. He had made peace with it early, or thought he had. But standing in the warehouse at dawn, with the operation wrapped and the team intact and the knowledge that his ears had kept every one of them alive when the board had shifted beneath their feet, the peace felt less like resignation and more like something he had earned. He found an empty crate, sat down on it, and pulled out his phone. He had a recording of the Chechens' calls queued up, and he wanted to go through them one more time before the adrenaline faded and the details started softening at the edges. The work wasn't done when the shooting stopped. It was done when every word had been captured, every pattern logged, every thread cataloged for whatever came next. From the main floor, Delgado's laugh carried through the building, full and warm, the sound of a man celebrating the simple fact of being alive and unshot on a Tuesday morning. Somewhere outside, Knox was making his way down from the hills, silent as he had been all night. Milligan was telling the bound Chechens man a story that the man clearly didn't want to hear, and Whitlock sat with his headphones around his neck and the recording in his ears, listening, because that was what he did, and because the next conversation that mattered could come at any time, and when it did, he intended to be the one who heard it. Chapter 4. They were 12 hours out of Tbilisi when the word came down. The team had relocated to a safe house on the outskirts of Batumi, a coastal city near the Turkish border that served as a convenient staging point for operations in the region. The house itself was unremarkable, a 2-story concrete structure set back from a quiet road, its shuttered windows and overgrown yard, giving it the look of a place that had been forgotten by everyone, except the people who used it for exactly this kind of thing. Inside, the furniture was sparse and functional, and the walls carried the faint smell of cigarette smoke from whoever had been there last. Colvin had given the team 6 hours to sleep after the warehouse operation wrapped. Most of them had taken it. Delgado had dropped onto a cot in the upstairs bedroom and was unconscious within 30 seconds, the M240 propped against the wall within arm's reach even in sleep. Knox had claimed a corner chair near the window and closed his eyes without appearing to change his level of alertness in any measurable way. Milligan had slept for 4 hours, woken up, done push-ups on the kitchen floor for 20 minutes, and gone back to sleep. Whitlock had spent the 6 hours going through the intelligence they had pulled from the warehouse, the laptop, the satellite phone records, the documents Voss had photographed. All of it spread across a folding table in the downstairs room, organized by language and then by relevance. His Russian translations filled 3 pages of a legal pad. The Georgian material filled 2 more. Cross-references between the two had started producing connections that would need time to develop. But the early pictures suggested the arms pipeline they had disrupted ran deeper and wider than the single warehouse had implied. He was still working when Colvin came downstairs with a look on his face that Whitlock hadn't seen before. Not concern exactly. Something closer to the expression of a man who had just been told something that changed the shape of everything he thought he was doing. "Pack it up," Colvin said. "We've been pulled." Whitlock looked up from the legal pad. "Pulled from what?" Whitlock asked. "Everything. Briefing in 20 minutes, secure channel, full team," Colvin said. He didn't elaborate. He turned and went back upstairs, and a moment later, Whitlock heard him moving through the rooms, waking bodies and giving the same short instruction to each one. "Pack it up. 20 minutes." Whitlock gathered his papers and stacked them neatly, a habit born from years of working with classified material in spaces that didn't have filing cabinets. Whatever was coming, the work on the table would either matter more after the briefing or not at all, and either way, it needed to be organized. The team assembled in the main room 18 minutes later. Colvin had set up the secure communications equipment on the same folding table Whitlock had been using. The satellite uplink connected and encrypted, the monitor angled toward the center of the room. 6 chairs had been arranged in a loose semicircle facing the screen. It had the feel of something between a classroom and a courtroom, the kind of arrangement that said someone important was about to talk and everyone else was about to listen. They took their seats. Delgado dropped into the chair closest to the door, his bulk making the metal frame creak in protest. Knox sat at the far end, slightly removed from the group, his posture unchanged from the chair he'd slept in. Milligan sat forward with his elbows on his knees, radiating the particular restlessness of someone who had been told to sit still and was already negotiating the terms. Voss took the chair beside Colvin, his expression neutral, his eyes on the blank monitor with the patient focus of someone who was accustomed to reading situations before they fully revealed themselves. Whitlock sat at the end opposite Knox and waited. The monitor came to life with the abruptness of a system that didn't bother with startup screens or loading bars. The image resolved into a room that Whitlock recognized immediately. A secure communications facility at the Pentagon. The kind of windowless, acoustically sealed space where conversations happened that would never be entered into any official record. The walls were bare. The lighting was flat and even. And seated at the center of the frame, filling it with the composed authority of someone who had earned every star and every gray hair on his head, was Colonel David Rains. Rains was in his late 50s, his face carrying the particular kind of wear that came not from age but from decades of decisions that carried consequences measured in human lives. His uniform was precise, his posture straight without being rigid, and his eyes moved across the camera with the quick, assessing quality of a man who was reading the room before the room knew it was being read. "Sam," Rains said. "Colonel," Colvin said. The exchange was brief and carried nothing on its surface, but Whitlock caught the weight beneath it. 2 syllables from each man, and in those syllables was a history that predated everyone else in the room. Rains's tone had softened by a fraction when he said the name. Colvin's had steadied, the way a man's voice does when he's speaking to someone he trusts, without reservation. Whatever these two had been through together, it had built something that didn't require explanation. Rains's eyes moved across the faces on the screen, quick in cataloging. He paused on each one for just long enough to register who he was looking at, his expression giving nothing away. When his gaze reached Whitlock, it stopped. "Who's the new one?" Rains asked. "Sean Whitlock, Linguistics and Signals Intelligence. Ph.D. out of Georgetown, 4 years in military intelligence before I recruited him," Colvin said. "How long has he been with the unit?" Rains asked. 8 months, Colvin said. Rains studied Whitlock through the camera for a moment longer than he had studied anyone else. It wasn't suspicion. It was the look of a man filing away a face he didn't know yet and reserving judgment until the face had earned one. "Welcome aboard, Whitlock," Rains said. "Thank you, sir," Whitlock said. Rains gave a short nod and shifted his attention back to the full group. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped into a register that pulled the air out of the room. "What I'm about to tell you is classified above any level you currently hold. What you hear in this briefing does not leave this room, does not get discussed over unsecured channels, and does not get referenced in any report, written or verbal, unless I personally authorize it. Is that understood?" Rains said. A chorus of affirmations moved through the room. Rains acknowledged it with a look that suggested the question had been rhetorical, and he had expected nothing less. 4 days ago, the USS Sovereignty was attacked and sunk in the Barents Sea, Rains said. The room didn't move. Nobody shifted in their seat. Nobody looked at the person next to them. The words settled into the space between the monitor and the chairs and sat there, heavy and undisturbed, because the men in this room had spent enough years in their particular line of work to know that reacting to the first sentence of a briefing like this was a waste of energy better spent listening to the second. Rains let the silence hold for a beat before continuing. The Sovereignty was a Virginia-class submarine operating on a classified patrol in Russian territorial waters. She was carrying 3 prototype nuclear warheads developed under a program that, as far as Congress and the public are concerned, doesn't exist. The warheads were part of a next-generation weapons platform being tested under deep cover. Their existence is known to fewer than 40 people in the entire U.S. government, Rains said. He paused, and the pause had the quality of a man making sure the foundation was solid before he put the next floor on it. The submarine was attacked by 3 unidentified vessels operating in a coordinated assault pattern. They crippled the Sovereignty with torpedo strikes, boarded her, removed the 3 warheads, and sank the boat. All hands lost. 134 sailors, Rains said. Delgado's jaw tightened. It was the only visible reaction in the room, and it lasted less than a second before his face returned to the flat, controlled expression that served as his working default. Beside him, Milligan had gone very still. The restless energy that usually ran through him like a current shut off entirely. The attack was professional, precise, and executed with intelligence that should have been impossible to obtain, Rains continued. Whoever planned this knew the Sovereignty's patrol route, her operational schedule, and the exact location of the warheads within the weapons bay. This was not an opportunistic strike. This was a planned operation carried out by people with access to information that exists in a very small and very secure circle. Voss spoke for the first time, his voice measured. "Do we know who?" Voss asked. "We do not. The attackers operated without identification. Communications intercepted during the attack were in Russian, but that tells us less than you'd think. What we know is what they did and what they took. The who is part of what you're going to find out," Rains said. Knox, who had been motionless throughout the briefing, shifted slightly in his chair. It was the equivalent of anyone else standing up and pacing. "Why us?" Knox asked. Rains looked directly into the camera when he answered, and the weight behind the words was considerable. "Because this cannot be handled through official channels. The Sovereignty was operating illegally in Russian waters. The warheads she was carrying were developed outside any authorized program. If this becomes public, the United States will be facing an international crisis that has nothing to do with the stolen nukes and everything to do with the fact that we put them there in the first place. The diplomatic fallout alone would be catastrophic, and that's before anyone starts asking what 3 prototype nuclear weapons were doing on a submarine parked off the Russian coast," Rains said. He let that breathe for a moment. "It gets worse," Rains said. "The Sovereignty is sitting on the bottom of the Barents Sea in Russian territorial waters. If the Russians find that wreckage, and eventually they will, they'll have a United States nuclear submarine loaded with classified weapons technology in their backyard, with no crew alive to explain what happened. Every conclusion they draw from that will be bad for us, and every conclusion they share with the world will be worse. So, we're the cleanup crew," Milligan said. There was no humor in it, just the flat recognition of what was being asked. "You're the only crew," Rains said. "There will be no official support, no backup, no extraction plan that I can guarantee. If you're caught, you don't exist. If you fail, this conversation never happened. I won't insult anyone in this room by pretending that's anything other than what it is." The room absorbed that without comment. Whitlock sat with it, turning the pieces over, feeling the shape of the thing Rains was describing. 3 nuclear warheads in unknown hands, a sunken submarine that was a ticking clock, a mission that the United States government would deny ever authorizing if it went wrong. It was the kind of problem that existed in the gap between what governments could do publicly and what they needed done privately, and the men who worked in that gap were the men sitting in this room. Colvin had been listening with the stillness of a man who had already processed most of this before the briefing started, the conversation that had brought him downstairs with that look on his face, having laid the groundwork. He spoke now for the first time since the briefing had begun, and his voice carried the settled quality of someone who had already made his decision and was simply confirming it for the record. "Where do we start?" Colvin asked. "Eastern Europe. The Sovereignty's patrol route suggests whoever attacked her had a staging area with access to the Barents Sea and a logistics network capable of moving 3 nuclear warheads without being detected. Your best starting point is the intelligence corridor between the Baltic states and the Russian border. Work your networks, follow the money, find the weapons," Rains said. "Timeline?" Colvin asked. "There isn't one. There's a window, and it's closing. Every day those warheads are in someone else's hands is a day closer to a scenario I don't want to describe to you because I don't want to describe it to myself. Find them and bring them back, or find them and make sure they can never be used. Those are the only 2 acceptable outcomes," Rains said. Colvin gave a single nod. Rains's gaze shifted back to the full group, moving across the faces one more time. He settled on the camera, looking through it at all of them at once. "I know what I'm asking. I've asked it before, of some of you in this room, and I've never asked it lightly, but I need you to understand the stakes. If these warheads are used, the consequences will be measured in ways that none of us are prepared to live with. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, this is the mission that matters," Rains said. The silence that followed was complete, not uncomfortable, not tense, just the silence of men who had heard what they needed to hear and were already beginning the process of converting words into action. "Sam, a moment," Rains said. The others understood the cue. They stood and filed out of the room without being told, the movement carrying the automatic discipline of people who knew when a conversation had shifted to a different level of classification. Whitlock was the last to reach the door, and as he crossed the threshold, he glanced back. Colvin was leaning forward in his chair, one hand resting on the edge of the table, his head slightly tilted in the posture of a man listening to something he took seriously. On the monitor, Rains had leaned in as well, the two of them closing the distance the technology imposed between them. Whatever passed between them in that moment, Whitlock didn't hear it. He pulled the door shut behind him and joined the others in the hallway. The team stood in a loose group, no one speaking, each of them processing the briefing in their own way. Delgado had his arms crossed, his eyes focused on a spot on the wall across the hall, working through something behind them that he wasn't sharing. Voss leaned against the wall with his hands in his pockets, his expression calm and calculating, already running scenarios. Knox stood apart, as he always did, his face offering nothing and requiring nothing in return. Milligan was the first to break the silence. "Well," Milligan said, "that's not what I was expecting to hear today." "What were you expecting?" Voss asked. "I don't know. Maybe a pat on the back for last night. A gift card, something," Milligan said. Delgado let out a short laugh that broke the tension by a degree. "3 nukes in the wind and he wants a gift card," Delgado said. "I'm just saying, the timing could have been better. I was going to take a shower," Milligan said. "You can shower on the plane," Voss said. "What plane?" Milligan asked. "Whatever plane Colvin has us on in the next 2 hours," Voss said. "You heard the colonel. The window is closing." Milligan looked at him for a moment, then nodded, the humor draining out of his expression as the weight of the briefing reasserted itself. Whitlock stood slightly apart from the group, in the space between the team and the closed door. He could still hear the low murmur of Colvin's voice through the wall, the words indistinct, but the tone unmistakable. Two men who had been through enough together to skip the parts of a conversation that didn't matter and get to the parts that did. He thought about Rains's pause when the camera had reached his face. The assessment. The reserved judgment. 8 months on this team, and to the man who gave the orders, he was still the new one. The door opened and Colvin stepped out. He looked at his team, each face in turn, and whatever Rains had said to him in private had not changed the steady quality that defined the man. If anything, it had reinforced it. He stood in front of them the way he always did, not above them, not apart from them, just at the front of them. And when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet certainty that made every person in the hallway believe what he was about to say. "We deploy in 90 minutes, pack light. We're heading east and we're going to be there for a while," Colvin said. Nobody asked questions. Nobody needed to. The briefing had given them the what and the why, and Colvin would give them the how when the how was ready. That was how it worked with this team. The trust ran in one direction, toward the man who had earned it by never wasting it. And right now, that trust was being pointed at something larger than anything they had faced before. They moved through the house with purpose, each man falling into the rhythm of preparation that was as familiar to them as breathing. Weapons checked, gear consolidated, personal effects reduced to what could fit in a single bag and be abandoned without regret. The safe house would be clean in 20 minutes, every trace of their presence removed, the folding table and chairs returned to the positions they had been in when the team arrived. Whitlock packed his equipment last. The legal pad with the Russian translations went into a waterproof sleeve. The recordings from the warehouse operation went onto an encrypted drive that fit in his pocket. The headphones went around his neck because they always did. Because even when he wasn't listening, he liked the weight of them there, the reminder that the next important thing someone said could come from anywhere and at any time. He walked out of the safe house and into the bright coastal light, the Batumi sun cutting across the gravel drive where 2 vehicles were already running. Delgado was loading the last of the gear into the back of the lead SUV, Milligan helping with the kind of aggressive efficiency that turned every simple task into a controlled collision. Knox was already in the second vehicle, behind the wheel, his sunglasses on, and his expression suggesting he had been ready to leave before anyone else had started packing. Whitlock climbed into the back seat of the lead SUV and pulled the door shut. Through the windshield, Colvin emerged from the house, locked the front door behind him, and walked toward the vehicles without looking back. He got into the passenger seat beside Delgado, and before the door was fully closed, he was already talking, his voice low, laying out the first steps of something that was going to consume every one of them for as long as it took. The vehicles pulled out of the drive, turned east onto the main road, and accelerated. Behind them, the safe house sat quiet and empty, the shuttered windows giving nothing away. And ahead of them, a road stretched out toward a part of the world where 3 nuclear warheads had disappeared, and no one who knew about it was sleeping well. The end.